For better or for worse, everyone is getting to know Donald Trump a whole lot better right now. But if you're from our area, you have been exposed to the Donald for decades. Bloomberg Business Week's cover story this week is all about Trump and all about his past. And earlier this week, Rich spoke with the author of that article, Max Abelson.
Just as a snapshot in terms of how polarizing he is, but maybe something more. They went around the celebrity row, if you will, around the U.S. Open before the Williams sisters match, and nobody got as big a reaction, and it was universally seemingly boos, than one Donald Trump, and I'm even counting a Kardashian in this. And I wonder, is that because New Yorkers know his shtick, it's a blue state, or is it something more, as that love it or hate this guy, he will elicit a response?
Wow. First of all, I didn't know that about the tennis game last night. That's a great detail. You know, I think that Trump must have been upset because he thinks of himself as this real New York builder. But I absolutely must pause for a second and say that I hope people read our story in Business Week because it's got a great scene at the U.S. Open in it. Yep. There's this scene in 1981 where there are hecklers in the stand. They're heckling Martina Navratilova and Chris Evert. And this big late 70s football linebacker who's working security at the game tackles some of the hecklers. And Donald Trump spots him and hires him as his bodyguard. And that man, Matt Calamari, has stayed with him since the early 80s and is now his chief operating officer. And the U.S. Open must have an important place in Mr. Trump's heart. I'm sure he was annoyed by that booing.
At the beginning of your interview, you posed to him a pretty straightforward question, I think, who you'd expect he would have gotten a bunch of times. Who does he admire or even go to for counsel in business? And seemingly after maybe a little bit of a pregnant pause, he says, me. Now, my question is we're going to get throughout this conversation, how much of that is bluster and how much of this, or is insecurity or whatever you want to psychobabble it is, and how much is that he really believes it?
You know, can I just say, I'm going to have to go back to my tapes because I recorded it, but I don't think the pause was even that pregnant. I think you just said, me, it's me. You know, when I spent time with him in person, I didn't feel as if I was spending time with someone who merely plays Donald Trump on television. I think there's something sort of irrefutably genuine about who he is as a person. But for me as a reporter, what was fun is that I got to find out who he is as a businessman and what his business looks like, which isn't always so clear.
Well, you'd speak to that. In fact, you said he's not self-made, but he's self-invented. And discuss that. I mean, we'll go through the arc of his business career, but it's not like he was rubbing nickels together. The old man was himself a developer, albeit in the outer boroughs. But you used an example from when the Verrazzano Bridge had its opening and how that was, in many ways for Trump, a seminal moment and kind of defined, from a PR standpoint, how he always wanted to kind of live his life.
Right. We all tell stories about ourselves and who we are as people. And by the time Donald Trump emerged in 1980s New York, he already had sort of an origin story for his own ego. And he told reporters, he told a reporter, I believe from the Times in 1980, you know, I was a young man in 1964. It was the year he graduated from the New York Military Academy, a prep school. And he said, you know, I was with my dad when the Verrazzano Bridge was opening. And my friends and I are in a book club. We read The Power Broker together, the wonderful Robert Caro biography about Robert Caro, the master builder. Robert Caro was unveiling the Verrazzano Bridge was opening, and Donald Trump says he saw in the rain, standing without his name being called or being recognized, the designer, the 85-year-old designer of the Verrazzano Bridge, and he was sort of standing there like a schmuck, without, you know, with no umbrella over his head and no one paying attention to him. And Donald Trump said to himself, at least as he told reporters, "I'll never let that happen to me. No one will ever make a fool of me. I want my name recognized." Trump clearly at an early age realized and wanted to telegraph to others that he wanted to be center stage and he wanted to sort of be the center of his empire.
You know, if there's boom and bust, there was Trump of the 80s, where there was New York City and certainly Atlantic City, and he did it really with other people's money, borrowed to the hilt, a little bit, if not a lot, personally guaranteed. And then things went belly up in the 90s, and he nearly lost it all. Talk about how close he came to complete personal bankruptcy, and how he ever built up enough trust equity with these folks that anyone would ever lend him money again.
You put that really well. Listen, I'll give you a good example. And on our drive from Trump Tower out to New Jersey, where I visited the golf course, we drove by these buildings that were incredibly important throughout Trump's life. One of them was the Plaza Hotel. And at his peak in the 1980s, he bought the plaza. And listen to this. He paid, the building cost about $400 million for the plaza back then. It was like 1987, something like that. Not only did Donald Trump borrow all of that money, he borrowed $400 million from the banks to buy a $400 million building, essentially. But then he borrowed more on top of it to do renovations. And that's dangerous. And what happened, of course, in the early 90s, I mean, his empire nearly tumbled to the ground. You know, here you asked a great question. Why would banks trust him again after he nearly collapsed? And one answer is that the new Trump empire that emerged from the wreckage relied much less on borrowing money. That Trump rather sort of used big partners. For example, Trump International is a building folks may recognize. It's where Central Park West hits Central Park South at Columbus Circle. Even though it's called Trump International, GE really put it up. And they sort of partnered with Trump and had Trump's name on it. Maybe Trump, I believe, oversaw the renovations. But that was really sort of the second life of Trump.
I have an anecdote, which is, you know, I play a lot of golf, and I played in Scotland, and we stopped at the Trump course. And even though I swallowed hard, I played it. It was a terrific track. But you learn a couple interesting things. One is, it's the most modest country when you're going to literally the birthplace of golf, but right in front when you go to play is a giant plaque telling everyone you're about to play the most amazing golf course, the greatest golf course in the world, which is so out of keeping with the balance of Scotland. Then you go out there and you play, and the caddies grumbling, and then by the back nine they'll tell you the truth, they're forced to buy their own bibs, what they'll do to hold the tees and all the rest here, which they don't do anywhere else. And then finally you go in the pro shop. You can't buy a thing if you have any form of self-dignity because the Trump name and logo is emblazoned on every single thing. But my question at the end is, somebody must be buying this. Did you get a sense, not only who the voter might be for this guy, but who are the customers that have the money but choose to attach themselves to this? Because I still can't figure it out.
Well, for me, I think that there are probably two very different answers for that. And we're living in a time of Thomas Piketty, the French academic, who has talked about the incredibly widening inequality, not just among the rich in America and the poor in America, but between the rich in America and the very rich. Now, who are Trump's customers? I believe it's them. Those are rich people who, find Trump appealing and like spending $150,000 to join one of his clubs and living in the lush in a lush Trump condo. But who's voting for Trump? Trump is going to need more than just very rich people to support him. And it's an interesting dichotomy, isn't it? That Trump's whole career is about, having sort of catering to the wealthy, at least when it comes to condos and golf courses. And yet his political career is about sort of being a populist and a hero to the everyman. And those two things are very far apart. And it's kind of a wonderful conundrum. I'm not sure I have a brilliant answer for that.
Do you have any sense down deep if this started as a lark, this presidential bid? Now he thinks he might win, but even if he doesn't, he still thinks he wins because he gets to go back to, the Apprentice days, if you will, even if he doesn't have the show, except he's now going to be taken more seriously.
Well, look, it is so early, and your viewers who are also voters should keep in mind that we're more than a year away from the 2016 presidential election. So who knows what could happen? Anything could happen. But I interviewed him in the beginning of August, just a few days before his first presidential debate. And he said things that sounded like that. He said to me, look, so far at least I'm having fun. I'm glad at least so far that I've done this. He sounded indeed like a man who wasn't taking it overly seriously. In other words, he sounded like a man who was sort of enjoying himself and was playing it by ear. Now, considering that he has managed to only go up and up and up from there, maybe he's not going to be telling reporters that anymore. Maybe from now on he's going to talk about himself as the next president of the United States of America.
And probably in the third person. Max, it was a great piece, and I encourage folks to go check it out, how Trump invented Trump here. Great job. I appreciate the time.
Thank you so much, Rich. All the best.
Up next on RFL, my sit-down interview with the man now in the driver's seat to become the next mayor of Mount Vernon. He just knocked off incumbent Ernie Davis in the primary, but Richard Thomas still has more work to do. We'll tell you what's next.